The secure telephone line in Washington, D.C. buzzed with urgency that October night. General Henry Arnold lifted the receiver as teletype machines hammered out their deadly arithmetic across 8th Air Force Headquarters in England. 600 airmen gone, 60 flying fortresses destroyed. The numbers painted a picture of impending disaster. Black Thursday had arrived with brutal clarity. Colonel Curtis Lamy's message crackled through static at exactly 21:47 hours. The daylight bombing campaign was bleeding to death over German skies. Without fighters that could reach deep into enemy territory, American bombers faced systematic annihilation. Arnold stared at the telegram's stark words. The entire strategic doctrine of American air power hung by the thinnest of threads. Suspension of deep penetration missions was no longer a request. It had become a military necessity. Yet somewhere in American factories, an aircraft was taking shape that would transform everything. Within months, American fighters would prowl the skies over Berlin itself. The Luftwaffe's carefully crafted defensive web would collapse under pressure from a machine that married British innovation with American mass production genius. The North American P-51 Mustang would accomplish far more than bomber escort duties. It would systematically destroy German fighter aviation as an effective military force. The brutal mathematics of strategic bombing had always demanded terrible sacrifices from air crews. Bomber crews operating from English bases faced statistical death sentences by autumn 1943. A complete combat tour required 25 missions over occupied Europe. Most B-17 crews never survived their 15th sortie. The odds were that simple and that deadly. German defensive planning had achieved remarkable sophistication through hard-won experience. 3 separate defensive barriers stretched across Western Europe, from the Channel beaches to the German capital. Fighter units positioned along the French coast would savage bomber formations the moment they crossed into occupied territory. Deeper inland, twin-engine interceptors armed with rockets and heavy cannons formed the second defensive line. These aircraft could stand safely beyond the range of defensive gunfire and lob explosive projectiles into tight bomber formations. The third and most dangerous line protected the industrial heartland, with elite squadrons flying the latest Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters. Radar installations tracked American formations from their assembly points over England. German controllers vectored interceptors with deadly precision toward incoming threats. The defensive system operated like an enormous killing machine. Fighter pilots would attack until their ammunition was exhausted, then land to refuel and rearm before taking off to attack the same bomber formation again. Single American formations might face identical German pilots 2 or 3 times during a single mission. General Adolf Galland had refined these tactics into instruments of mathematical destruction. His experienced pilots concentrated on formation leaders, knowing that destroying command aircraft would scatter entire bomb groups. They attacked head-on, exploiting the B-17's weakest defensive sector. Twin-engine fighters remained beyond effective gun range, while launching rockets that forced bombers to break formation and become vulnerable to single-engine attacks. The convergence of British desperation with American industrial might created the unlikely genesis of the P-51 Mustang. British purchasing commissioners approached North American aviation in April 1940 with a straightforward request. They wanted the company to manufacture Curtiss P-40 fighters under licensing agreements. Company President James Dutch Kindleberger responded with a counter-proposal that would reshape aviation history. His engineers could design and construct a superior fighter within the same time frame required to establish P-40 production facilities. 102 days after contract signature, prototype NA-73X lifted into California skies. Revolutionary design features included a laminar flow wing that dramatically reduced drag at operational speeds. Early versions powered by Allison engines showed tremendous promise, but suffered from inadequate high-altitude performance. The breakthrough occurred when Royal Air Force test pilot Ronald Harker flew a Mustang Mark I in April 1942. He immediately recognized that the airframe's potential was constrained only by its power plant limitations. Rolls-Royce engineers began installing their Merlin 61 engine in a Mustang fuselage within days. The same two-stage supercharged power plant that had transformed Spitfire performance would work similar magic on the American design. The Merlin-powered Mustang achieved 441 miles per hour at 30,000 feet altitude. Internal fuel capacity of 269 gallons provided a combat radius of 475 miles without external tanks. Drop tanks extended that radius to 850 miles, placing Berlin within reach from East Anglian airfields. Berlin lay exactly 580 miles from American fighter bases. The Packard-manufactured V1650-3 engine generated 1,490 horsepower at altitude, maintaining power where German fighters began losing effectiveness. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, Jr., serving as assistant military attaché in London, became the Mustang's most enthusiastic champion within military circles. A former Lafayette Escadrille pilot and 10-goal polo player, Hitchcock grasped both technical specifications and tactical implications of the Mustang's revolutionary capabilities. His detailed reports to General Arnold emphasized a critical strategic point that would prove decisive. The Mustang could reach Berlin, fight effectively upon arrival, and still possess sufficient fuel reserves for the return journey to England. Major General Adolph Galland commanded Jagdgeschwader 26 when American bombers first appeared over occupied France in August 1942. Combat experience spanning the Spanish Civil War, Battle of Britain, and Eastern Front had earned him 94 aerial victories by his November 1941. Promotion to General der Jagdflieger. Galland understood the strategic implications of American daylight precision bombing better than most German military leaders. The Americans were attempting what the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve over Britain during 1940: systematic destruction of enemy war production through precise targeting of critical industrial facilities. Success would cripple Germany's capacity to sustain prolonged warfare across multiple fronts. The German fighter force defending the homeland consisted of approximately 800 single-engine and 150 twin-engine fighters by late 1943. These aircraft were operated by a steadily diminishing pool of experienced combat pilots. The Eastern Front consumed trained aviators at catastrophic rates throughout 1942 and 1943. Training programs had been compressed from 24 months to 6 months duration to maintain minimum pilot strength levels. Newly graduated pilots arrived at operational squadrons with only 110 to 150 hours of total flight experience compared to the 250 to 300 hours typical of their American counterparts. German defenders possessed several critical advantages that partially offset their numerical disadvantages. They fought over familiar territory, allowing damaged aircraft to reach friendly airfields and pilots to return to combat quickly. Concentrated defense permitted achieving local numerical superiority despite overall inferior numbers. Most importantly, German fighters only needed sufficient fuel to reach incoming bomber streams, while American escort fighters faced round-trip flights of over 1,000 miles. The August 17, 1943 mission plan appeared tactically brilliant in its calculated complexity. Two separate bomber forces would strike simultaneously at Schweinfurt's critical ball-bearing manufacturing plants and Regensburg's Messerschmitt production facilities. The divided assault would theoretically split German fighter resources between widely separated targets. The Regensburg force would continue southward to North African airfields, avoiding the deadly return flight over heavily defended German territory. 376 B-17 flying fortresses prepared for takeoff that morning from bases across East Anglia. The Regensburg force departed precisely on schedule at 700 hours as planned. Dense fog blanketed the Schweinfurt force's airfields, delaying their departure by 90 critical minutes. This timing failure destroyed the mission's carefully orchestrated coordination. German fighters that had intercepted and attacked the Regensburg formation possessed sufficient time to land, refuel, rearm, and launch fresh attacks against the delayed Schweinfurt force. Lieutenant Colonel Birna Ley Jr., flying with the Regensburg formation, later documented the savage aerial combat. Fighter aircraft queued up in systematic attack formations. American bomber formations began dissolving as B-17s fell burning or exploded in massive fireballs. The sky filled with parachutes, aircraft debris, and crisscrossing tracer fire patterns. 60 flying fortresses were destroyed that day. 600 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured in a single mission. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated conclusively that unescorted daylight bombing operations were militarily unsustainable. American commanders suspended deep penetration missions for 6 weeks, while desperately searching for viable tactical solutions. The operational suspension could not continue indefinitely. Political pressure from Washington demanded renewed attacks against German war production facilities. Military intelligence indicated that ball-bearing manufacturing had recovered substantially from the August raid damage. Another strike against Schweinfurt was ordered for October. 291 B-17s crossed the Dutch coastline at 1300 hours on October 14th. Escort fighters, Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, turned back at Aachen when their fuel tanks reached critical levels. The bombers continued alone for another 200 miles toward their targets. The Luftwaffe response was overwhelming in its coordinated intensity. Over 300 German fighters attacked in precisely timed waves designed to maximize bomber destruction. Major Wilhelm Moritz, leading Jagdgeschwader 3, employed revolutionary new tactics developed specifically for bomber formation attacks. His fighters carried 210mm rockets fired from beyond the effective range of American defensive machine guns. Each rocket warhead contained 90 pounds of high explosives, sufficient to completely destroy a heavy bomber with a single direct hit. First Lieutenant Robert McCallum, piloting Paddlefoot, watched the coordinated attacks develop with growing horror. German fighters approached from 12 o'clock high in perfect formation. Wings erupted with cannon fire patterns. The rockets resembled aerial torpedoes trailing dense smoke plumes. Direct hits caused B-17s to simply disintegrate in midair without warning. The bombing results achieved excellent accuracy against primary targets. Post-mission reconnaissance photographs revealed severe damage to critical ball-bearing manufacturing facilities. However, 60 bombers had been lost, with another 17 written off due to extensive battle damage. 650 airmen became casualties in a single afternoon. Survivor morale collapsed completely following the second Schweinfurt disaster. The daylight bombing offensive had reached its critical breaking point. Political and military leaders faced the possibility of campaign suspension or complete tactical revision. The first P-51B Mustangs arrived at Royal Air Force Station Boxted in Essex County on November 20, 1943. The 354th Fighter Group, technically assigned to the 9th Air Force for administrative purposes, was immediately placed under 8th Air Force operational control for combat missions. Group pilots had trained extensively on P-39 Airacobras and P-47 Thunderbolts in the United States. Few had accumulated significant flight time in Mustangs before arriving in England. Major James Howard, commanding the 356th Fighter Squadron, conducted his initial orientation flight on November 25th. The moment he advanced the throttle for takeoff, he recognized they possessed something extraordinary. At 30,000 feet altitude, where P-47 struggled to maintain power, the Mustang still had performance reserves to spare. December 1st, 1943, marked the Mustang's European combat debut during a fighter sweep over Belgium and northern France. 5 days later, on December 5th, the group flew its first bomber escort mission deep into German-occupied territory. Results were immediately apparent to mission planners. Bomber loss rates dropped dramatically whenever Mustangs provided escort protection to target areas. Lieutenant General James Doolittle assumed command of the 8th Air Force on January 6, 1944. The former racing pilot and aeronautical engineer brought a fighter pilot's tactical perspective to the bomber-dominated 8th Air Force command structure. His first official visit was to 8th Fighter Command Headquarters at Bushy Hall outside London. Doolittle noticed a sign prominently displayed in the operations room that summarized existing fighter doctrine. The sign read, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." Doolittle asked who had posted the sign. Major General William Kepner, commanding 8th Fighter Command, replied that it had been there when he assumed command. Doolittle ordered it removed immediately and replaced with new guidance that would revolutionize American fighter tactics. The replacement sign read, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." This simple doctrinal change transformed American fighter employment throughout the European theater. Previously, fighters had remained closely tied to bomber formations, flying defensive weaving patterns above them to maintain protective positions. Doolittle freed them to hunt German fighters aggressively. Fighter groups would fly ahead of bomber streams, intercepting German formations as they assembled for attacks. They would pursue retreating Germans to their airfields and strafe grounded aircraft. Colonel Donald Blakesley, commanding the 4th Fighter Group, embraced the revolutionary tactics immediately. The former Eagle Squadron pilot had flown Supermarine Spitfires with the Royal Air Force before transferring to American service. Blakesley understood fighter combat dynamics from extensive Battle of Britain experience. He instituted flexible formations, abandoning rigid 3-aircraft elements for maneuverable 2-aircraft teams. He pushed squadron pilots toward aggressive tactics, seeking combat opportunities rather than waiting for defensive reactions. Operation Argument, historically known as Big Week, represented full implementation of the new offensive strategy. For 6 consecutive days, the 8th Air Force from England and 15th Air Force from Italy launched maximum effort raids against German aircraft production facilities. Over 3,000 bomber sorties delivered 10,000 tons of explosives against fighter and engine manufacturing plants. However, the decisive battle occurred in aerial combat rather than ground bombing. P-51 Mustangs, now equipping 5 complete fighter groups, ranged deep into German airspace seeking combat. On February 20th, Major James Howard single-handedly defended an entire bomber formation against 30 German fighters for over 30 minutes of continuous combat, earning the Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism. His after-action combat report demonstrated characteristic brevity and understatement. Saw enemy aircraft attacking bombers. Engaged, same. German losses during Big Week reached catastrophic proportions that shocked Luftwaffe leadership. The German fighter force lost 355 aircraft in aerial combat, plus another 150 destroyed on the ground by strafing attacks. More critically, 17% of the entire German fighter pilot force was killed during those 6 days. These were the experienced combat veterans whose skills and knowledge could not be replaced through training programs. Flight schools could produce new pilots with basic flying skills, but not the tactical expertise and combat experience necessary for survival in high-intensity aerial warfare. The psychological impact of American fighters reaching Berlin cannot be overstated among German military and civilian populations. Berlin represented the heart of the Reich, Hitler's personal capital, and the ultimate symbol of German military power throughout occupied Europe. No single-engine Allied fighter had ever penetrated German defenses to reach the Nazi capital before March 1944. Colonel Donald Blakesley led 81 P-51Bs of the 4th Fighter Group on that historic first mission to Berlin. Weather conditions were terrible throughout the flight route. Solid cloud cover extended from 2,000 to 28,000 feet altitude, forcing navigation by dead reckoning and precise timing. The bomber stream stretched for miles across German airspace. Over 800 heavy bombers protected by nearly 900 escort fighters participated in the massive raid. Captain Donald Gentile, flying Shangri-La, engaged German interceptors near Hanover during the inbound flight. We dropped our external tanks and dove on about 30 Me-109s and FW-190s, forming up below us. They scattered immediately when they saw us coming. I caught one Me-109 and gave him a 3-second burst. He rolled over and went straight down. The Luftwaffe response was fierce, but poorly coordinated due to tactical surprise. German ground controllers had not anticipated single-engine American fighters appearing over the German capital. Radio intercepts captured their confusion and disbelief at reports of Mustangs over Berlin. Many German pilots initially refused to believe the P-51s were actually American aircraft operating from English bases. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Oberhansley, leading the 358th Fighter Squadron, remembered the moment of reaching Berlin airspace. The flak was incredible at bomber altitude, dense enough to walk on, but we were above it, looking down on this massive aerial battlefield. And we were there. American fighters over the German capital for the first time in history. 2 days later, the 8th Air Force returned to Berlin in even greater strength and determination. 660 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, escorted by 900 fighters, attacked transportation and industrial targets in and around the German capital. Major General Adolf Galland personally led Jagdgeschwader 1 into desperate combat. Flying his personal Focke-Wulf 190A, marked with distinctive personal insignia, Galland attempted to break through escorting fighters to reach the bomber formations. However, his formation was intercepted by patrolling Mustangs before reaching effective firing range. His wingman was shot down before they could engage bombers. The Luftwaffe lost 69 fighters destroyed and 26 damaged during that single day's combat. American losses totaled 35 bombers and 11 fighters. The mathematical equation was becoming increasingly clear to German leadership. The Luftwaffe could not sustain such catastrophic loss rates while American strength grew steadily each day. With 7 fighter groups equipped with P-51 Mustangs by April 1944, 8th Fighter Command shifted to purely offensive operations designed to destroy the Luftwaffe systematically. Fighters swept far ahead of bomber formations, catching German aircraft as they attempted to take off from their bases. They remained behind after bombers turned homeward, hunting German formations returning from combat. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, developed innovative Zemke's Wolfpack tactics that maximized fighter effectiveness. His P-47 Thunderbolts would simulate bomber formation radio chatter patterns, drawing German fighters into carefully prepared ambushes by P-51s flying high-cover positions. On April 8, 1944, Lieutenant Robert Goebel shot down his 5th German fighter to achieve ace status. We caught them taking off from Brandenburg Airfield. The inexperienced pilots would raise their landing gear, and try to turn immediately. Their aircraft would stall and crash without any shooting from us. The veterans would build up speed first, but by then we were positioned perfectly to attack them. In May 1944, the strategic bombing campaign shifted primary focus to Germany's synthetic oil production facilities. The improved P-51D model had begun arriving in April, featuring 6 50-caliber machine guns instead of 4, a bubble canopy for enhanced visibility, and improved high-altitude performance characteristics. On May 12, 1944, 800 heavy bombers attacked synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Politz, and Zeitz, escorted by 800 fighters in the largest air operation to date. The Luftwaffe launched everything available in desperate defense. Over 500 German fighters participated in what became the largest air battle in aviation history to that point. Major George Preddy, commanding the 487th Fighter Squadron, achieved multiple aerial victories during the massive engagement. They came up in huge formations, everything they had. We'd dive through them shooting, zoom back up to altitude, and dive through again. It was controlled chaos, but we definitely had the tactical advantage. The Luftwaffe lost 126 fighters destroyed and 64 damaged during that single day's operations. American losses were 46 bombers and 13 fighters. The exchange ratio had become completely unsustainable for German fighter aviation. While German aircraft production actually increased throughout 1944 despite bombing damage, pilot quality had collapsed completely. Newly graduated pilots arrived at operational squadrons with minimal training and rarely survived their initial combat missions. The Luftwaffe's pilot replacement system could not keep pace with combat losses. The ultimate test of air superiority came on D-Day, June 6, 1944. Over 13,000 Allied aircraft of all types supported the Normandy invasion operations. The Luftwaffe managed only 319 total sorties over the invasion beaches throughout the entire day. Allied fighters claimed 42 German aircraft destroyed for the loss of 35 Allied fighters. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer flew 3 separate missions on D-Day. "We owned the sky completely and absolutely. We'd patrol over the invasion beaches for hours without seeing a single German aircraft. Then we'd fly inland, destroying German military convoys that were trying to move during daylight hours." The Luftwaffe's virtual absence over Normandy represented complete and total defeat of German air power. Fighter units had been withdrawn eastward to defend the Reich against bombing attacks. Those few remaining in France lacked adequate fuel supplies, spare parts, and experienced pilots to conduct effective operations. By July 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force capable of influencing military operations. Statistical analysis told the story with brutal mathematical clarity. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe operated approximately 2,395 single-engine fighters across all fronts. By June 1944, despite producing over 3,000 new fighter aircraft, operational strength had fallen to only 1,023 aircraft. Pilot losses were absolutely catastrophic during this period. 2,262 German fighter pilots were lost during the first 5 months of 1944 alone. American fighter claims for 1944 totaled 5,154 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, plus 4,131 destroyed on the ground through strafing attacks. The P-51 Mustang accounted for 4,150 of these total victories. Mustang losses during the same period totaled 2,520 aircraft, producing a victory-to-loss ratio of nearly 2-to-1. The transformation from October 1943 to June 1944 was absolutely remarkable in its speed and completeness. In October 1943, the 8th Air Force had nearly suspended daylight operations due to unsustainable bomber losses. By June 1944, American heavy bombers could attack any target within Germany with acceptable casualty rates. The key difference was comprehensive fighter escort capability, specifically the P-51 Mustang's unique ability to accompany bomber formations deep into enemy territory and fight effectively upon arrival. The systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe produced consequences extending far beyond the strategic bombing campaign itself. Without air cover protection, German ground forces in Normandy were subjected to devastating and continuous tactical air attacks. Allied fighter bombers destroyed tanks, trucks, trains, and artillery pieces with complete impunity throughout the battlefield. The German Army's greatest tactical advantage, its operational mobility, was completely eliminated by Allied air supremacy. The Eastern Front suffered equally severe consequences from Luftwaffe units transferred westward. These squadrons were unavailable to support Wehrmacht operations against advancing Soviet forces. The Red Air Force achieved complete air superiority by mid-1944, contributing significantly to the catastrophic German defeats during that summer's campaign. German war production, despite Albert Speer's remarkable organizational innovations, could not overcome the cumulative effects of strategic bombing combined with fighter attacks. Aviation fuel production fell from 196,000 tons in May 1944 to only 30,000 tons by September. High-octane aviation gasoline production virtually ceased entirely. Luftwaffe training flights were cancelled due to fuel shortages. Newly manufactured aircraft sat idle on airfields without fuel for test flights or pilot training. The psychological impact on German civilian morale was equally profound and far-reaching. Cities located deep within the Reich were subjected to precise daylight bombing attacks. The Luftwaffe, once the symbol of German military might and technological superiority, could no longer protect German civilians from Allied air attacks. The technological lessons learned from Mustang development influenced military aviation design philosophy for decades following the war's end. The combination of high-altitude performance, extended range capability, and heavy armament became the standard template for fighter aircraft design throughout the jet age. The decisive importance of industrial capacity, comprehensive training systems, and tactical innovation had been proven conclusively through combat results. The P-51 Mustang represented far more than mere technological advancement in aircraft design. It demonstrated the decisive importance of industrial capacity in modern warfare between industrialized nations. North American aviation produced 15,000 Mustangs during the war, with peak monthly production reaching 600 aircraft. German aircraft production, despite reaching record levels during 1944, could not match this sustained output while simultaneously replacing combat losses on 3 active fronts. The Mustang development program proved the strategic value of international cooperation between Allied nations. British engineering expertise, embodied in the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, combined with American mass production capabilities to create the war's most effective fighter aircraft. The Packard Motor Company's ability to mass-produce the complex Merlin power plant demonstrated American industrial adaptability under wartime pressure. Training systems proved equally crucial to ultimate success in aerial combat operations. American pilots reached combat theaters with 250 to 300 hours of total flight experience, trained safely in the continental United States with unlimited fuel supplies and training aircraft availability. German pilots, their instruction constantly interrupted by Allied bombing attacks on training facilities, reached operational units with only 110 to 150 hours of flight experience. This qualitative difference in pilot preparation proved as strategically important as numerical superiority in aircraft numbers. Strategic bombing campaign success depended entirely upon adequate fighter escort protection throughout the mission profile. Pre-war theoretical assumptions about self-defending bomber formations proved disastrously incorrect when tested against determined fighter opposition. Heavy bombers could destroy enemy war production facilities, but only when fighters protected them from interception attempts. Command philosophy and tactical doctrine mattered decisively in determining operational outcomes. Doolittle's tactical revolution, releasing fighters from restrictive close escort duties, completely transformed the European air war's character. By adopting offensive tactics, American fighters forced the Luftwaffe to fight on American terms and timing. German fighters could no longer choose optimal times and locations for engagement with bomber formations. They were forced into defensive reactions against American fighter sweeps and patrol patterns. On April 25, 1945, the 8th Air Force conducted its final combat mission of the European War. 370 B-17 Flying Fortresses, escorted by 550 P-51 Mustangs, attacked railroad marshalling yards in Czechoslovakia near Prague. Not a single German fighter rose to challenge the massive formation. The Luftwaffe had completely ceased to exist as an operational military force. General Adolf Galland, during extensive post-war interrogation sessions, provided a professional military assessment of the Mustang's decisive impact. The American long-range fighter was the single decisive factor in achieving air superiority. Without fighter escort, daylight precision bombing would have failed completely. With escort protection, we were absolutely helpless to defend our airspace, our cities, or our ground forces. Hermann Göring's famous observation, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost," captured the immediate psychological impact on German leadership. However, his detailed technical analysis proved more militarily revealing and significant. Your heavy bombers might have eventually succeeded through pure attrition alone, given sufficient time and acceptable losses. But long-range fighter escort changed everything fundamentally. It destroyed my fighter force not through gradual attrition, but through systematic annihilation in a matter of months. The P-51 Mustang's legacy extended far beyond World War II combat operations. Mustangs served effectively in Korea, providing close air support when early jet aircraft lacked sufficient range for extended battlefield operations. Foreign air forces operated Mustangs well into the 1980s in various roles. Veterans of the European Air War continued gathering for reunions decades after the conflict's end. Former enemies often found common ground in their shared survival of history's greatest and most decisive air battle. The transformation they had witnessed and participated in remained almost impossible to comprehend fully. Colonel Hubert Zemke, reflecting on the complete transformation from defeat to victory, offered this assessment years later. In late 1943, we were losing badly and knew it. Heavy bombers couldn't survive deep penetration missions without prohibitive losses. Then the Mustang arrived in operational numbers. Within 6 months, absolutely everything had changed. It wasn't just the aircraft itself, though that was crucial. It was the entire integrated system of training, tactics, leadership, and industrial support working together. But without the Mustang's unique capabilities, none of the other factors would have mattered at all. The United States Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base displays a completely restored P-51D painted as Cripes a Mighty 3, the aircraft flown by Major George Preddy, the highest-scoring Mustang ace with 26.83 confirmed aerial victories. Museum visitors often ask why this particular World War II aircraft receives such prominent display space among supersonic jets and spacecraft. The answer lies in pure historical impact and significance. The P-51 Mustang demonstrated that technological superiority, when combined with adequate industrial capacity and human courage, could achieve objectives that seemed impossible under existing circumstances. It proved that air power could be strategically decisive in modern warfare between industrialized nations. Most importantly, it showed that democratic nations could produce both weapons and warriors capable of defeating totalitarian tyranny when faced with existential threats to their survival and values. The transformation from Black Thursday to complete air superiority required less than 6 months of sustained operations. In October 1943, American heavy bombers faced systematic annihilation over German-defended targets. By April 1944, American fighter aircraft completely dominated German airspace, from the English Channel to Berlin and beyond. The catalyst for this remarkable transformation was a single aircraft type that combined the best elements of British and American aeronautical engineering. Contemporary historians continue debating strategic bombing's ultimate effectiveness and moral implications in modern warfare. However, none dispute fighter escort's absolutely decisive impact on the campaign's military success. Without P-51 Mustang escort capability, the combined bomber offensive would have failed completely. With Mustang protection, Allied air power helped destroy Nazi Germany's capacity to wage effective warfare on multiple fronts simultaneously. The mathematical transformation was genuinely profound in its implications. During 1943, the 8th Air Force lost approximately 1 heavy bomber for every ton of explosives successfully delivered to German targets. By mid-1944, that exchange ratio had improved dramatically to 1 bomber lost for every 40 tons of ordnance delivered accurately. The difference was measured in thousands of American and Allied lives saved through improved operational effectiveness. General Carl Spaatz, commanding United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, offered this final professional assessment of Mustang impact. The P-51 was quite simply the weapon that won the air war over Europe. Everything else we possessed — bombers, air crews, ground support, intelligence capabilities — would have been completely wasted without adequate fighter escort to target areas. The Mustang gave us that essential capability we had lacked. Young men in P-51 Mustangs defeated the Luftwaffe over German skies and secured Allied victory in the air war. Their achievement ensured D-Day's success, enabled the strategic bombing campaign, and significantly hastened the end of World War II in Europe. The Mustang accomplished far more than providing bomber escort protection. It fundamentally changed the course of military history through technological and tactical innovation. The concrete runways of former 8th Air Force bases now serve civilian aviation purposes or have returned to agricultural use. The pilots who flew Mustangs in combat are passing into history with each year. However, their collective achievement endures as permanent proof that advanced technology and human courage can overcome seemingly impossible military odds when properly applied. At Duxford Imperial War Museum, a fully restored P-51D regularly conducts flight demonstrations for visitors. The Merlin engine's distinctive sound and the laminar flow wing's graceful lines remind observers of an era when such aircraft represented aviation's absolute pinnacle of achievement. Children watch in wonder, while aging veterans remember when entire squadrons of Mustangs filled European skies during the struggle for freedom. Museum guides explain technical specifications and combat records to interested visitors. However, the P-51's true historical legacy transcends mere statistics and numbers. It lies in the complete transformation from defensive defeat to overwhelming offensive power within months. America's P-51 Mustang overwhelmed the Luftwaffe through much more than simple technical superiority over existing German aircraft. It succeeded through the convergence of international cooperation, massive industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and extraordinary human courage under extreme pressure. Faced with catastrophic losses that threatened campaign failure, the United States Army Air Forces adapted quickly and triumphed decisively. The Mustang was the essential instrument of victory, but ultimate success belonged to the comprehensive system that produced, maintained, and employed it effectively. This system could recognize serious problems, develop viable solutions, and implement necessary changes under the enormous pressure of total war. As the final veterans pass away, their legacy remains clearly visible. Technological superiority, when properly employed through sound tactics and strategy, can achieve completely decisive victory. The P-51 Mustang's ability to reach Berlin didn't simply save the daylight bombing offensive from failure. It validated American military doctrine and permanently established air superiority as absolutely essential for modern military operations across all theaters. The Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe from 1939 through 1943, was reduced to complete impotence by a single aircraft type produced in overwhelming numbers. The same nation that pioneered strategic bombing at Guernica now cowered helplessly under Allied air attacks, unable to protect its cities or ground armies. Statistical summaries tell only part of this remarkable story. Nearly 5,000 German aircraft destroyed in combat. Hundreds of thousands of tons of explosives delivered precisely to targets. Combat effectiveness ratios that exceeded all pre-war predictions and expectations. However, the true strategic impact lay in what was successfully prevented through air superiority. The collapse of the strategic bombing offensive, significant war prolongation, and countless additional Allied casualties were avoided through Mustang deployment. When Colonel Donald Blakesley led his Mustangs over Berlin on March 4, 1944, he demonstrated that American military power could penetrate to the very heart of enemy territory. The sight of American fighters circling over the Nazi capital sent an unmistakable message throughout German-occupied Europe. Liberation was inevitable and approaching rapidly. The technological achievement represented by Mustang development was truly remarkable by any measure. In less than 4 years, North American aviation designed, tested, refined, and mass-produced an aircraft that exceeded the performance of German fighters developed over twice as long. Merlin engine integration, accomplished in months rather than years, demonstrated how wartime urgency could accelerate innovation dramatically. The fuselage fuel tank addition, extending operational range to Berlin despite stability concerns, showed pragmatic problem-solving under enormous operational pressure. However, advanced technology alone did not defeat the Luftwaffe in aerial combat. Young men, averaging 22 years of age, mastered complex aircraft systems, learned sophisticated combat tactics, and engaged in mortal combat at altitudes where ambient temperatures reached -50 degrees Fahrenheit. They flew in formations numbering hundreds of aircraft, maintaining precise positions while constantly scanning for enemy fighters, monitoring critical instruments, and managing fuel consumption carefully. A single moment of inattention meant almost certain death. The German pilots they faced in combat were equally courageous, defending their homeland against overwhelming numerical odds. By 1944, many Luftwaffe veterans flew their third or fourth different aircraft type, each with distinctly different flight characteristics and combat capabilities. They faced American bombers and fighters by day, Royal Air Force attacks by night, and Soviet air forces along the Eastern Front. They operated from airfields under constant Allied attack with steadily declining fuel supplies and spare parts availability. The human cost of achieving air superiority was absolutely staggering for both sides. The 8th Air Force lost 26,000 airmen killed in action, with 28,000 additional personnel becoming prisoners of war. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 40,000 pilots, with most casualties occurring during the war's final 18 months. Each statistical loss represented personal tragedy for families, communities destroyed, and human potential unrealized through premature death. Yet from this enormous tragedy emerged tactical and strategic transformation that would influence military operations for generations. P-51 success proved air superiority absolutely essential for modern military operations across all domains. Ground forces could not operate effectively under sustained enemy air attack. Naval forces required air cover for survival. Strategic bombing demanded comprehensive fighter escort throughout mission profiles. These crucial lessons, learned at enormous cost over Germany, shaped military doctrine and force structure for decades following the war's end. The Luftwaffe's final collapse came with startling rapidity that surprised even Allied intelligence analysts. In January 1944, German fighter aviation remained formidable and dangerous, despite growing Allied numerical superiority. By June, it was operationally broken. By September, it existed primarily on paper with minimal combat effectiveness. The speed of this systematic collapse testified to American strategic effectiveness and the P-51 Mustang's absolutely decisive impact on aerial warfare. 8 decades later, certain fundamental lessons remain absolutely clear and applicable to modern military challenges. Technological superiority can overcome geographic disadvantages when properly applied. The P-51's extended range capability negated Germany's strategic depth advantage completely. Industrial capacity proves decisive in prolonged conflicts between industrialized nations. America's ability to simultaneously produce thousands of Mustangs while manufacturing heavy bombers, training air crews, and supplying allied nations proved strategically decisive. Tactical innovation multiplies technological advantages exponentially. Doolittle's offensive fighter employment transformed the P-51 from a defensive weapon into an offensive instrument of German destruction. Most importantly, P-51 success demonstrated democratic society's remarkable ability to mobilize effectively for total war when facing existential threats. The aircraft was designed by a company that had never previously built fighter aircraft, powered by a foreign engine, and flown by citizen soldiers who had been civilians 3 years earlier. This extraordinary achievement testifies to democratic society's inherent strength when confronting tyrannical threats to freedom and human dignity. The P-51 Mustang's legacy extends far beyond military achievements and combat statistics. It represents American innovation, industrial capability, and national determination when faced with seemingly impossible challenges. It symbolizes the Anglo-American alliance that proved strategically decisive in defeating fascist tyranny. Most fundamentally, it embodies the courage of young men who flew into hostile skies and prevailed through skill, determination, and technological advantage. As military aviation enters the age of unmanned systems and artificial intelligence, the P-51's lessons remain remarkably relevant to contemporary challenges. Advanced technology provides military capability, but human judgment determines proper application. Industrial capacity enables military power projection, but strategic vision directs its effective employment. International cooperation multiplies individual national strength exponentially. The story of America's P-51 Mustang defeating the Luftwaffe represents transformation through innovation when facing strategic failure. The United States recognized problems, developed solutions, and implemented changes under total war's enormous pressure. The Mustang was the critical instrument, but victory belonged to the integrated system that could adapt rapidly to changing circumstances. The P-51 Mustang ended the Luftwaffe's European dominance, enabled the Normandy invasion's success, and shortened World War II significantly. In accomplishing these objectives, it saved countless lives and demonstrated that technological superiority, combined with courage and industrial might, could overcome any military challenge. This fundamental lesson, learned over German skies, remains as relevant today as when American fighters first appeared over Berlin, forever changing the course of human history.